Nebuchadnezzar, the pride and fall of a king. The night was restless. A shadow loomed over the great city of Babylon, but it was not the kind cast by its magnificent walls or the towering ziggurats that reached toward the heavens. It was something deeper, unseen, an unease that gripped the mind of the most powerful man on earth. King Nebuchadnezzar II lay in his royal bedchamber, staring into the darkness. His breaths were heavy, his chest rising and falling in turmoil. He had always been a man of great confidence, a ruler whose name inspired both awe and fear. And yet, tonight, something had shaken him to his core. A dream. Not just any dream. This was no ordinary vision of the mind, no fleeting images conjured by wine or fatigue. This dream had weight. It carried power and authority beyond his own. He sat up abruptly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool night air. His wife, Queen Amethyst, stirred beside him but did not wake. Nebuchadnezzar turned his gaze to the towering columns of his chamber, adorned with murals depicting his victories, his conquest of Jerusalem, his crushing of Egyptian forces at Carchemish, his ascension to power. But even as he looked upon these testaments of his greatness, the dream whispered to him again. A statue, colossal, fearsome. Its head was of pure gold, shining, majestic. Its chest and arms, silver, strong yet lesser. The belly and thighs of bronze, sturdy and enduring. Its legs of iron, unbreakable, yet its feet, its feet, a fragile mixture of iron and clay. And then came the stone. It was not cut by human hands. It struck the statue at its feet, shattering them. The mighty image crumbled, collapsing into dust, carried away by the wind as if it had never been. But the stone grew into a mountain, filling the whole earth. The king's heart pounded in his chest. He clenched his fists. What did it mean? Was this an omen? A sign from the gods? He would not rest until he knew. At dawn, the call went out across the palace. All the wise men of Babylon, the sorcerers, the astrologers, the diviners, were summoned to the great hall. The king stood before them, his gaze dark, his expression unreadable. "You are the wisest men in my kingdom," he said, his voice a low thunder. "You claim to understand the mysteries of the heavens. Now prove it." The Magi bowed, their robes trailing on the marble floor. "May the king live forever," one of them said. "Tell us the dream, and we will interpret it." Nebuchadnezzar's jaw tightened. His patience was thin. "No," he said. "If you are truly wise, you will not need me to tell you the dream. You will tell me what I saw and what it means." The court fell silent. The wise men exchanged uneasy glances. "O great king," another ventured, "no man on earth can do what you ask. Only the gods." Nebuchadnezzar slammed his fist on the golden armrest of his throne. "Enough. If you cannot do as I command, then you are frauds, and frauds have no place in my kingdom. Guards, execute them all." The soldiers stepped forward, swords drawn. A single voice rose above the chaos. "Wait!" All eyes turned toward the speaker. A young man, barely more than a boy, stood at the edge of the assembly. His garments were foreign, not of Babylon, but of Israel. He was one of the exiles the king had taken captive years before, Daniel. "If the king will grant me time," Daniel said, his voice calm, "I will reveal the dream and its interpretation, not by my wisdom, but by the power of the Most High God." Nebuchadnezzar studied him. There was something in this young man's eyes, a confidence unlike the false bravado of the other wise men. Slowly, the king nodded. "You have until sunrise." Daniel and his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, gathered in prayer that night. While the palace feasted, They knelt before the true King of Kings. God of heaven, Daniel whispered, reveal what is hidden. Show us what you have shown the king. As the night deepened, the answer came. Daniel gasped as the vision flooded his mind. The statue, the stone, the mountain, it was all there, clearer than any dream. By sunrise, Daniel stood once more before Nebuchadnezzar. The great king leaned forward, eyes sharp. Speak. Daniel took a deep breath. O king, the dream you saw was given to you by the God of heaven. You, O king, are the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar's lips curled into a smirk. Of course, he was the golden head, the greatest of kings, the ruler of the world. But after you, Daniel continued, will come another kingdom inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth, then a fourth, strong as iron but divided. The king's smirk faded. The feet, iron mixed with clay, show that the final kingdom will be divided, partly strong, partly weak. And then, O king, a stone not cut by human hands will strike this kingdom, and it will crumble. The stone will grow into a great mountain that fills the earth. This, O king, is the kingdom of God. It will endure forever, while all other kingdoms fade. The room was silent. Then Nebuchadnezzar did something no one expected. He fell to his knees. Before Daniel, before an exile, a foreigner. Surely, the king murmured, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings. He rose to his feet and with a nod to his attendants made his decree. Let all men know, Daniel shall be placed in high honor over Babylon, and his God, his name shall not be blasphemed. Yet, even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt remained in his heart. He was still the ruler of Babylon. His kingdom still stood, and as the days passed, a question nagged at him. Why should my kingdom ever fall? A plan began to form in his mind, a plan that would challenge the very God who had spoken. The morning sun cast long shadows over the plains of Dura. The land stretched wide and open, a vast stage for an event never before seen in Babylon's history. At the center of it all stood the statue. It was unlike anything the world had ever beheld, a colossus of pure gold, standing nearly 90 feet high, gleaming under the fierce desert light. Its surface reflected the golden sands, a symbol of wealth, of power, of the eternal glory of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar sat upon his royal throne, watching as thousands of people assembled from across his empire. Governors, satraps, high officials, priests, warriors, all had been summoned. The king leaned forward, fingers pressed together. His dream had told him that his kingdom was but a head of gold, temporary, fleeting. But Nebuchadnezzar was determined to prove otherwise. Why should my kingdom fall, he thought. Why should Babylon ever be replaced? If his dream had been of a statue with different metals, then he would create one entirely of gold. Let all who saw it know, Babylon would endure forever. The royal herald stepped forward, his voice ringing through the plain. Nations and peoples of every language, this is the command of King Nebuchadnezzar. The crowd hushed, every eye fixed on the speaker. At the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold. Whoever refuses will be thrown into a blazing furnace. A murmur spread through the crowd. This was more than just loyalty to Babylon. This was worship. The music began. One by one, men and women fell to their knees before the golden colossus. Thousands bowed in obedience, faces pressed against the dust of the plain. All but three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stood alone. While the sea of people knelt, these three remained upright, their faces calm but resolute. They had seen Nebuchadnezzar's power firsthand. They had lived in his courts, been trained in his ways. But they would never bow to his gods. It wasn't long before jealous officials noticed. Your Majesty, they said, kneeling before Nebuchadnezzar, May you live forever. But we must bring to your attention that there are certain Jews whom you appointed over the provinces of Babylon who refuse to bow." The king's expression darkened. "Who are they?" "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." For a moment, Nebuchadnezzar sat in silence. These were no mere rebels. They were his trusted officials, men of high rank. But no one defied the king and lived. "Bring them to me," he ordered. The three men stood before the king, their faces unreadable. Nebuchadnezzar rose from his throne, stepping down from the dais. He walked toward them, his voice dangerously soft. "Is it true," he asked, "that you refuse to bow before my gods?" The three did not flinch. Nebuchadnezzar's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps you did not hear the decree. I will give you one more chance." He motioned toward the furnace, its flames licking the sky, fueled by stacks of wood and tar. The heat from it was already unbearable, even at this distance. "If you bow now, your lives will be spared," the king said. "But if you refuse, you will be thrown into the fire. And then," his voice grew sharp, "what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego looked at one another, then back at the king. With calm determination they answered, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the furnace, our God is able to save us, and he will save us. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will never bow to your gods or worship the statue you have set up." The air grew heavy. Nebuchadnezzar's face twisted in rage. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter," he bellowed. The guards rushed forward, shoving the three men toward the raging inferno. "Bind them." Thick ropes were tied around their wrists and ankles. Soldiers dragged them toward the furnace, its flames now white-hot, radiating a heat so intense that even standing near it caused the guards to break into a sweat. With a final shove, the men were thrown inside. A moment later, the flames consumed the soldiers who had cast them in. But inside the furnace, something unbelievable was happening. Nebuchadnezzar watched, his heart pounding. The fire roared, crackling, devouring everything within. But then, his eyes widened. He turned to his advisors, his voice almost a whisper. "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire?" They nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty." Nebuchadnezzar's hands gripped the railing. "Then why do I see 4 men walking in the fire?" The flames danced around them, but they were untouched. Their robes were not burning. Their bodies were not consumed. And the 4th, his face was radiant. His form was unlike any man's. "The 4th looks like a son of the gods." The king stumbled backward. His heart pounded. Was this their God? Had their God truly saved them? He took a shaky breath and called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out." The 3 men stepped from the furnace, unharmed. Not a single hair was singed, not a thread of their robes was burned, and there was not even the smell of smoke on them. Nebuchadnezzar fell to his knees. Before them, before the men who had refused to bow to him, he, the king of Babylon, the ruler of nations, the conqueror of cities, was bowing before the power of their God. "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he declared. "No other God can save in this way." He turned to his scribes. "Let it be written, anyone who speaks against their God will be put to death." The decree was sent across the empire, and Nebuchadnezzar, for the first time, knew he had met a power greater than his own. Yet, though he had seen the miracle of God, his pride was far from broken. The time was coming when Nebuchadnezzar would face his greatest humiliation yet, not from man, but from the hand of the Almighty himself. The dream of the great tree would soon come to pass. The throne room of Babylon was silent, save for the faint crackling of torches lining the great marble walls. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, sat upon his golden throne, his fingers gripping the carved lions on its arms. His eyes were shadowed, haunted. The dream had come again. It was not like the dream of the golden statue. This one felt different, more personal. He leaned forward, his voice low and troubled. "Summon the wise men, the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans. I want them here at once." The royal attendants rushed from the chamber, their footsteps echoing down the corridors. Nebuchadnezzar exhaled, rubbing his temples. For weeks he had not slept well. Each night the same vision replayed in his mind, so vivid it was as if he stood within it. A tree. Not just any tree, but the greatest tree he had ever seen. Its trunk was massive, its branches stretched to the heavens. The leaves were lush and green, its fruit abundant, feeding all who came to it. Birds nested in its branches. Beasts rested in its shade. It was a tree of life and power. Then the voice had come. "Cut it down." Nebuchadnezzar swallowed hard, remembering how the mighty tree had shaken as unseen hands struck it. Leaves fell like rain. The branches snapped and collapsed, the trunk splintered. Only the stump remained, bound with iron and bronze. Then came the strangest part. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let his mind be changed from that of a man to that of a bee-beast. Let 7 times pass over him. Nebuchadnezzar's fingers curled into a fist. It made no sense. Who was he in this dream, and what did it mean? The chamber doors swung open. The wise men filed in, their robes sweeping the polished floors. They bowed low before the king. "O king, may you live forever," one said. Nebuchadnezzar fixed them with a sharp gaze. "I have had a dream," he said. "A dream that troubles me deeply. Tell me what it means." The Magi stepped forward. "Speak the dream, O king, and we shall interpret it." Nebuchadnezzar clenched his jaw. He knew these men. They were cowards. They would tell him only what he wanted to hear. A slow sigh left his lips. He waved a hand. "Leave me. Bring Daniel." Daniel stood before Nebuchadnezzar, his posture straight, his hands folded before him. He had aged since that first encounter, but his eyes still held the same piercing wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar exhaled. "I know the spirit of the gods is in you, Daniel. You have never failed me before. Listen to my dream, and tell me what it means." And so he described it, every detail, every whisper of the voice. When he finished, Daniel was silent, too silent. Nebuchadnezzar studied him. His most trusted interpreter was pale, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes full of sorrow. "Speak," the king demanded. Daniel hesitated. Then softly he said, "O king, if only this dream were for your enemies and not for you." Nebuchadnezzar's stomach tightened. Daniel took a slow breath. "The great tree you saw, it is you, O king." The words landed like a blow. "You have grown mighty, your greatness reaching to the heavens. All nations shelter under your rule. You are the most powerful ruler on earth." Nebuchadnezzar nodded slightly. So far, this was what he had expected. But Daniel's voice grew grave. "The order to cut down the tree, that is a decree from the Most High." The king's breath hitched. "You will be driven away from men. You will live among the beasts of the field. You will eat grass like an ox. You will be drenched with the dew of heaven. You will live as an animal until 7 years have passed." A chill crawled up Nebuchadnezzar's spine. "But," Daniel continued, a glimmer of hope in his voice, "the stump remains. This means your kingdom will be restored to you, once you acknowledge that heaven rules." Silence. Nebuchadnezzar felt his pulse in his ears. Daniel stepped forward, his voice pleading now. "O king, please, renounce your sins. Do what is right. Show mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps then your prosperity will continue." Nebuchadnezzar stared at him. Repent? Of what? Was he not the greatest? Had he not built Babylon with his own power? His heart hardened. He would not bow, not to a god he could not see. 1 year later, Nebuchadnezzar stood atop the Hanging Gardens, his most prized creation. The city of Babylon stretched out before him, golden and glorious under the afternoon sun. Walls thick enough for chariots to ride upon, palaces of unmatched splendor, temples that pierced the sky. He spread his arms wide. Is this not the great Babylon I have built as my royal residence, by my power and for my glory? The words had barely left his lips when the sky split with thunder. A voice, mighty and terrible, filled the air. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has been taken from you. Pain exploded in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He clutched his head, a scream ripping from his throat. His vision blurred, the world tilted. The next thing he knew, he was falling. The gardens, the palace, the city, gone. He was on all fours, crawling in the dirt. His body trembled, his heart pounded like a war drum. You will be driven away from men. His skin itched. His breath came in panting gasps. You will eat grass like an ox. His hands, no, not hands, claws. His nails, long, jagged, curling like talons. His hair, wild, matted, tangled like an animal's fur. Until you acknowledge that heaven rules. The king of Babylon was no longer a man. He was a beast. And he ran into the wilderness, screaming. 7 years passed. 7 years of wandering, of madness, of being hunted like a wild animal. And then, one morning, as the sun rose over the distant towers of Babylon, a figure crawled from the wilderness. His eyes lifted to heaven, and his mind returned. Tears streamed down his weathered, dirt-streaked face. His lips trembled. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are just, and those who walk in pride. He is able to humble. The beast had become a man again, and Babylon's greatest king had been broken by God, only to be restored by his mercy. The day Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon was one of astonishment. His advisers, once resigned to his madness, could hardly believe their eyes when they saw him standing at the palace gates, clothed in rags, his hair unkempt, his nails broken and long like claws. But his eyes were clear. For the first time in years, Nebuchadnezzar looked at his city, not with pride, but with humility. His time in the wilderness had changed him. He no longer saw himself as a god among men. He was merely a man, one whom God had raised and could cast down in an instant. When the royal officials rushed to him, bowing in reverence, he simply said, "The Most High God has restored me. Let all of Babylon know he alone is king." The court was stunned. The same Nebuchadnezzar who had once built a golden statue of himself now stood before them, speaking of a power greater than his own. It was unheard of. And yet none dared question him, for they saw it in his face. Nebuchadnezzar had been broken and remade. In the years that followed, Babylon flourished once more under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. But he was not the same king who had ruled before. Where once he had demanded worship, he now gave honor to the God of heaven. Where once he had sought glory, he now sought wisdom. He rebuilt Babylon, not to exalt himself, but to serve his people. He strengthened its walls, restored its temples, expanded its gardens. But he did not deceive himself. He knew now that his power was borrowed, a gift given and taken at God's will. So he issued a final decree, one that would be sent across the empire. To all peoples, nations, and languages who dwell in all the earth, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was once filled with pride, believing that my power was my own. But the Most High God humbled me. I lived as a beast, my mind taken, my body broken. Yet in his mercy he restored me. Now I know his kingdom is everlasting, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. The words were written, sealed, sent. The greatest king of Babylon had bowed before the Almighty, and with that his reign neared its end. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years. He lived longer than many kings, reigning over the greatest empire of his time. But death comes for all men, even kings. One evening, as he stood upon the royal terrace, gazing at the city he had rebuilt, he felt a strange peace settle over him. He had spent years warring, conquering, building, but now none of it mattered. Not the golden walls, not the ziggurats, not even his own name. What mattered was the truth he had come to know. Man rules for a moment, but God rules forever. The next morning, Nebuchadnezzar did not rise. The servants who entered his chambers found him lying still, his hands folded over his chest, his face serene. The king was dead, and Babylon would never be the same. With Nebuchadnezzar gone, the golden age of Babylon began to unravel. His successors were weak and corrupt, more interested in pleasure than power. His son, Marduk, ruled briefly before being assassinated. His grandson, Belshazzar, was a fool who mocked the very God who had humbled Nebuchadnezzar. Under their rule, Babylon grew arrogant and complacent, blind to the growing Persian threat to the east. Then, one fateful night, during a great feast in the palace, Belshazzar dared to drink from the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem's temple. As he laughed, mocking the God of Israel, the room fell silent. A hand, an invisible, terrifying hand, began to write on the palace wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Terror gripped the room. No one understood the meaning. Then they called for Daniel, now an old man. He read the writing aloud. God has numbered your days and brought your kingdom to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom will be given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the Persian army, led by Cyrus the Great, entered Babylon without a fight. The city that had once been the jewel of the world fell in a single night. And just as Nebuchadnezzar's dream had foretold, Babylon was no longer the head of gold. Its empire had ended. Nebuchadnezzar's story did not die with him. For centuries, his name would be remembered as the greatest of Babylonian kings, the builder of wonders, the conqueror of nations. Historians would write of his great walls, palaces, and temples. Archaeologists would uncover the ruins of his mighty city, remnants of a once great empire. But his true legacy was not in stone or gold. It was in the words he had spoken at the end of his life. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways are just. He humbles those who walk in pride. Babylon's walls crumbled. Its empire vanished. Its kings were forgotten. But the truth Nebuchadnezzar had learned remained. For God's kingdom is everlasting, and his rule will never end. Nebuchadnezzar's story is one of power, pride, and redemption. He had everything a man could desire, wealth, armies, glory, yet he was nothing before God. His rise was great, his fall was greater, but his restoration was the greatest of all. His life teaches a truth that echoes through the ages. No king is greater than God. No empire lasts forever. Pride leads to destruction, but humility leads to restoration. And so, though Babylon fell, the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar remains. A warning to the proud, a comfort to the humble, a testimony to the Most High. The same God who humbled Nebuchadnezzar is still in control today. He still humbles the proud, and he still lifts up those who acknowledge him. So what will we choose? Pride or humility? Join the journey. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful biblical stories, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future videos. Like this video if you learned something new today. Comment below. What did you learn from Nebuchadnezzar's story? I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more stories of power, faith, and God's incredible plan for humanity. Until then, stay blessed, stay humble, and keep seeking truth. Subscribe now.